Today we're talking about extroverted thinking, or TE, and I'd like to go a little bit more in depth than in previous videos where I talked about this function in different types, TJs and FBs specifically, but also how this function works depending on the position in the stack. Today, my goal is to talk about TE from the perspective of Carl Jung, and go a little bit more in depth into understanding what this function is, what it brings, how it manifests itself, and so on. In psychological types, Jung gave a pretty comprehensive description of all of the 8 cognitive functions. He went quite in depth into describing them, comparing them to each other, and so on and so forth. Although I understand that his writing might be a little bit more difficult to read through. But today I'd like to dissect some of his descriptions, share my thoughts with you about it as well, and my interpretations. So tune in for that. I hope you really like this video. If you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's dive in. So, in psychological types, Jung starts by describing thinking as such. Thinking in general is fed from 2 sources. Firstly, from subjective and in the last resort, unconscious roots, and secondly, from objective data transmitted through sense perceptions. You see how here he already starts by linking thinking as a function to the other mental processes, the other cognitive functions, right? Sense perception, which we might call sensing, but also from subjective unconscious roots, namely intuition, okay? I like how Jung basically connected the functions to each other, and often, even though he categorized them in a pretty TI fashion, he also drew connections between functions in the attempt to make us understand how the psyche works all together as a whole. And then when it comes specifically to extroverted thinking, he described it as such. Extroverted thinking, therefore, need not necessarily be a merely concretistic thinking. It may equally well be a purely ideal thinking if, for instance, it can be shown that the ideas with which it is engaged are to a great extent borrowed from without, as in they are transmitted by tradition and education. The criterion of judgment, therefore, as to whether or no a thinking is extroverted, hangs directly upon the question by which standard is its judgment governed. Is it furnished from without, or is its origin subjective? So basically what we can kind of understand by looking at Jung's classification of extroverted thinking and introverted thinking is that both types of thinking care about facts, okay, about information, about objective things in the world. However, their way of processing information and their way of kind of making decisions or getting to conclusions differs based on this orientation. In his work, Jung talked a lot about orientation, and by orientation he meant the distinction between extroversion and introversion, which in his opinion was one of the most important distinctions in the mind. And he said that both TE and TI, extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, work together in a similar fashion. He also described how these different types of orientations dissect the thinking in a very different way. And for extroverted thinking, he namely highlighted the idea that extroverted thinking will eventually care a lot about the conclusions that it has to impact the outside environment. Whereas introverted thinking will care more about those conclusions feeding back into the subjective mind, into the subjective logic, something that we now call this inner or personal logical framework that we often associate with introverted thinking, okay? And now going a bit deeper with how extroverted thinking works, Also, something that Jung described is that in accordance with his definition, we might picture a man whose constant aim, insofar of course as he is a pure type, is to bring his total life activities into relation with intellectual conclusions, which in the last resort are always orientated by objective data, whether objective facts or generally valid ideas. These types of man gives the deciding voice not merely for himself alone, but also on behalf of his entourage, either to the actual objective reality or to its objectively oriented intellectual formula. By this formula are good and evil measured, and beauty and ugliness are determined. All is right that corresponds with this formula, all is wrong that contradicts it. So, what he's trying to say here is that extroverted thinking will always try to find a principle, a logical one, that works for as many instances as possible. I've seen a lot of people defining extroverted thinking, and I think there's value in all of these definitions in a certain way. But I think the main idea stems from the same source, namely that extroverted thinking is a cognitive function that is striving to kind of mobilize all of these understood facts in such a way that they mold together, they become a logical conclusion or a principle or a formula that works for as many situations as possible, as many people as possible. Some people call this what works for others. Some people call it dominating others, whatever. The idea is that with this mental process, people who have this function as a dominant function or as an auxiliary function, but namely a dominant one, ENTJs, ESTJs, this function will actively and constantly look to find a ruling principle that applies as much as possible in the world, okay? And the reason behind this, as Jung says, is that basically these people are trying to find something that works in order to support justice and truth. And quote, this is not from any great love for his neighbor, but from a higher standpoint of justice and truth. So because a TE hero type or a dominant TE type is constantly looking for defining reality in the way that makes the most sense, they will try to deny everything that does not fit with the formula and try to look in the environment for all of the characteristics, all of the information that would align with this ruling principle that it has. Everything in his own nature that appears to invalidate this formula is mere imperfection, an accidental misfire, something to be eliminated on the next occasion, or in the event of further failure, then clearly a sickness. So I think Jung is presenting a slightly exaggerated picture of TE, but it does a good way of doing that because it helps us understand this function better. It shows us how TE is constantly looking to find validation and support for that formula that it has created. The more things in the real world align with this formula, the better, and the more inconsistencies or exceptions that this function finds, the more difficult it will be for the function to accept it. Basically, he also described how people who value TE more than other judging functions, so TI, FE, or FI, a certain pattern occurs, namely the fact that these people will often strive to allow this formula to define as many situations as possible. And because for them, this is aligned with their moral principle, it will be very difficult to accept that other people might not want or might not agree with that specific way of, acting or doing something. This is probably why in our current understanding of things, ESTJs and ENTJs, but also INTJs and ISTJs are perceived to be domineering. Not always, but it's quite a stereotype, because they might find it more difficult to accept different ways of doing something, because for them it makes no sense. They're like, if I spend so much time trying to understand what the best formula is, a formula that will help people act on it, and this makes so much sense to me, why would I want to change it? And why would other people not want to accept it? Because I'm trying to implement it in such a way that it helps as many people as possible. And I think this is why we often find a conflict between TE and TI types. Namely, they will get in some sort of a competition with each other sometimes, especially TE hero and TI hero types. So ENTJs, ESTJs with INTPs and ISTPs. Because they will try to convince each other that the way they understand something logically makes the most sense. On the one hand, ENTJs and ESTJs will try to allow this formula to work in as many situations as possible. And if they're on a leadership role, they will try to push it onto TI types as well. Whereas the TI types might be quite resistant to it. They might like to challenge the TE user to think more about it, to think about the exceptions as well. Sometimes the TI user will do it to kind of annoy the TE type, or simply to try to see how the other person thinks, to see if they can still support their argument, even if they are presented with different contradicting ideas maybe, or contradicting facts, or whatever it might be. And this reminds me, I've heard certain ISTPs and INTPs say that the reason I'm challenging you with this, and I guess it applies very well to ENTPs and ESTPs, the reason why I'm challenging you about this is not necessarily that I disagree with you. I just want to position myself on a contradictory role so that I see what your thinking style is, so I can see what your thinking process is and how you can argue your position better, and to see if you still agree with it after all. And I think this is quite an interesting way to look at the dynamic between these two types of thinking. And it will be a conflict that can be manifested both internally and externally. As in, a TE type might feel deep down that, you know, the ideas or arguments presented by the TI hero are challenging and interesting, but they might not always want to admit it outwardly. Or it can be a real conflict between two people fighting with each other to prove that no, my idea is right, no, mine is. But I think based on everything that Jung has written about extroverted thinking, the main idea that stands out is that TE looks at facts, objective information, experience, whatever it might be, and aims to integrate that to have it become a ruling principle or formula that works in the real world for as many people, as many situations as possible. Okay? You can think even of, you know, those stereotypical CEOs or managers who often tend to be TE types, who, you know, try to devise a system that works for the whole company with certain KPIs, objectives, etc., which can be exceptionally good and helpful to the, you know, well-functioning of the company. At the same time, it can be sometimes detrimental because it can become too rigid if the TE type is not open to allowing other types of thinking to coexist. And I see this distinction between the two types of thinking as described earlier. TI will challenge TE often to think of other ways of looking at something. But here the advantage that TE has is that it's much more decisive. It believes in that formula or principle so much that it has the power to implement it. And I think it's amazing to kind of value people who do this, because they bring a valuable contribution in the society, just as all of the other functions do, or all of the other types do. But sometimes structure is needed, and TE does a good job of implementing that structure into as many situations as possible. And yes, the issue with it might be that it doesn't leave room for changes, or it can become quite inflexible and rigid. It can become very uncaring with respect to other people's emotions as well, opposing extroverted feeling a lot, and basically suppressing everything that is related to feeling, especially as a dominant or hero function. Jung also described how the inferior feeling works when it comes to TE types. And I'll quote him here as well. The inferiority of feeling in his type manifests itself also in other ways. Insofar as it corresponds with a dominating positive formula, the conscious attitude becomes more or less impersonal, often indeed to such a degree that a very considerable wrong is done to personal interests. When the conscious attitude is extreme, all personal considerations recede from view, even those which concern the individual's own person. His health is neglected, his social position deteriorates, often the most vital interests of his family are violated. They are wronged morally and financially, even their bodily health is made to suffer, all in the service of the ideal. And I think this is a very good description of TE, namely TE hero types that suppress introverted feeling, and I would say also extroverted feeling, because focusing so much on this ruling principle of formula, this objective truth that they strive for, they will suppress everything that is related to the subjective nature, everything that is related to their feelings, their health, their body, their relationships, the way other people feel, and so on and so forth. And of course, as it is the case with all of the functions, when such a discrepancy, such a lack of balance happens, the psyche is not functioning properly, and certain types of mental health issues occur. Depression, anxiety, relationship problems, isolation, and so on and so forth. So yeah, this is basically the main idea that I'd like you to stay with after this video. And I'm quite curious to see what are your thoughts and your understandings related to extroverted thinking. And again, thank you a lot for watching this video. Thank you for being with me in this journey. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe.